The Young and the Restless. Spoilers full, please like, share, and subscribe's video. Thank you. Phyllis and Nick were overjoyed to see Summer back in Genoa, but a tragic incident had driven them mad. Summer was a strong woman in Genoa, but in another city she might not have dared to stand up and take revenge. Summer had gone through so much, which was why she was so broken. Phyllis wept as she looked at her daughter. Summer loved Milan, wanting to build a life and career there, but it wasn't easy at all. Summer cried, wanting to change herself, but the bad guys were always targeting her. Behind that polished story lay a darker one, and Summer had buried it because some of the pain was too humiliating, too terrifying to speak of, like reliving that pain. During her time in Milan, she met an older woman who at first seemed harsh and controlling, but strangely became infatuated with her. What began as emotional manipulation gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The woman isolated her, threatened her, studied her weaknesses, and treated her with a cruelty Summer could never fully explain to anyone afterward. There were times Summer thought she was simply trapped in the orbit of an incredibly unstable stranger. But now, the truth was emerging with horrifying clarity. That woman was Patty. Summer recounted her experiences, her sobs growing louder. Meanwhile, everything faded, and Summer slapped Patty to vent her anger. She described fear, psychological torment, the constant feeling of being watched, cornered, and tested. She described the terrifying moment when she realized the woman tormenting her was not only cruel, but also capable of murder. And then came the part that made everyone in the room look at Victor differently, because Summer didn't believe Patty acted alone. Once the pattern became clear, it was unforgettable. Patty hadn't chosen Summer randomly. Summer wasn't just a young girl in trouble. She was Victor Newman's niece. She was Phyllis and Nick's daughter. She was connected to Jack through the complicated history of both families. Suddenly, that possibility became unbearable. Was Patty merely the hand and Victor the manipulator? Was the woman hired, encouraged, or manipulated to attack Summer, acting under Victor's influence? That very thought sounded insane too, brutal to accept without resistance. Yet Genoa City had witnessed Victor do unforgivable things whenever he believed that the end justified the means. Power was always more important than innocence to him. Strategy was always more important than sentiment. If he believed Summer's suffering could serve a greater purpose, who could be sure he would never allow it to happen? That was the moment Nick exploded. Until then, his anger had been almost suppressed, smoldering within him as Summer tried to speak. But the moment Victor's name was linked to the possibility of hiring Patty or instigating her, something within Nick shattered. Years of resentment toward his father surged back with brutal force. Victor had manipulated his children, lied to them, exploited them, tested them, and betrayed them so many times that anger had become part of the family legacy. But this time was different. This was Summer. This was Nick's daughter, his little girl, standing there broken by memories she should never have had to carry. He turned toward Victor with a rage that stripped away his last shred of restraint. There was no room for diplomacy, no desire to hear another cold justification, no patience for another speech of power and necessity. Nick lunged at him and grabbed him by the throat, his face contorted with anguish and hatred, demanding an answer that could never be good enough. The room descended into chaos. Victor, even in his shock, still carried that hateful air of authority, that unbelievable arrogance that anyone dared lay a hand on him. But Nick didn't care. In that moment, he wasn't facing the legendary Victor Newman. The mahogany walls of the Abbott mansion, usually a bastion of generational wealth and comfort, felt like the crushing walls of a tomb. Jack Abbott was missing. The patriarch, the steady heartbeat of the family, had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a chilling silence that threatened to tear his loved ones apart. Diane Jenkins paced the length of the Persian rug in the living room, her manicured nails digging so deeply into her palms that they drew blood. Her breathing was shallow, erratic. Billy Abbott stood by the fireplace, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked violently beneath his skin. Kyle, Jack's son, was furiously typing on his phone, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night of dead ends and unanswered calls. We're running out of time. Diane's voice trembled, shattering the heavy silence. Victor has his hands in this. I can feel it. He's been circling Jack like a vulture for weeks. Billy slammed a fist against the mantel. If Victor Newman has harmed one hair on Jack's head. Just then, Kyle's phone buzzed with a decrypted location ping. A private investigator they had hired off the books had finally cracked the GPS coordinates of a burner phone associated with Victor's recent shadowy transactions. Kyle's face drained of color. The Marina, Pier 47. There's a private yacht registered to a shell corporation, one that traces back to a subsidiary Victor dissolved years ago. He's on a boat, Diane gasped, grabbing her coat. We have to go. Now, the drive to the Genoa City Marina was a blur of screeching tires and suffocating dread. The night air was thick with fog rolling off Lake Michigan, a damp, bone-chilling mist that seemed to mirror the coldness of Victor Newman's calculated machinations. Diane, Billy, and Kyle sprinted down the wooden docks, the sound of their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the eerie quiet of the marina. Aboard the Times, Sea Siren Times, a sleek, unassuming yacht moored at the very end of the pier. The atmosphere was nauseatingly sweet. The cabin reeked of cheap lavender perfume and the sterile chemical stench of heavy sedatives. Jack Abbott slumped in a velvet armchair, his usually sharp, vibrant eyes clouded and unfocused, his head lolled to the side, fighting against the heavy tide of the narcotics coursing through his veins. Standing over him, humming a discordant lullaby, was a ghost from his darkest past, Patty Williams. Her blonde hair was styled in an erratic, youthful manner that starkly contrasted with the unhinged, hollow darkness in her eyes. She stroked Jack's cheek with the back of her hand, her touch feather-light but laced with lethal intent. "Oh, Jack," she cooed, her voice a sickening sing-song. "We're finally together. No more Diane, no more Victor telling us what to do, just you and me sailing away." Jack's lips moved, a sluggish, unintelligible murmur escaping him. He was trapped in a chemical prison, unable to fight back as Patty prepared another syringe, the clear liquid catching the dim cabin light. "Victor said you'd be stubborn," Patty giggled, a sound that resembled breaking glass. "But he promised if I did exactly what he asked, I could have you all to myself." Before the needle could pierce Jack's skin, the heavy cabin door was kicked open with a deafening crash. The splintering of wood was followed immediately by the enraged roar of Billy Abbott. "Get your hands off him, you psycho," Billy bellowed, lunging into the cramped space. Diane screamed as she saw Jack's lifeless posture, shoving past Kyle to reach her husband. "Jack, oh my God, Jack, what has she done to you?" Patty stumbled back, dropping the syringe. Her eyes widened, darting around like a cornered animal. "No, you can't be here. He's mine. Victor gave him to me." "Victor gave you nothing but a one-way ticket to a padded cell." Patty Kyle spat, his fists raised as he positioned himself between the deranged woman and his helpless father. The standoff was a powder keg, the air crackling with decades of bad blood, betrayal, and raw, unfiltered hatred. But before Billy could restrain Patty, a commotion from the deck outside froze them all. Footsteps, stumbling, frantic, desperate footsteps thudded against the fiberglass hull. A shadow fell over the cabin doorway. It was Summer Newman, but this was not the Summer Newman that Genoa City knew. This was not the poised, immaculate fashion executive who had taken Milan by storm. The woman clinging to the doorframe was a shattered husk. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt, her blonde hair matted to her skull by sweat and the damp fog. Her eyes were wide, dilated, and darting with a feral, all-consuming terror. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she let out a guttural, wounded sob. Summer Kyle breathed his anger instantly, evaporating into profound shock. "Summer, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Milan." Summer didn't seem to hear him. Her gaze was locked entirely on the interior of the cabin. She had followed the chaos, perhaps drawn by the shouting, perhaps guided by a twisted twist of fate. She had returned to Genoa City in secret, fleeing a nightmare only to walk directly into another. I had to come back. Summer stammered, her voice raspy as if she had been screaming for days. I had to escape. The dark. The cold. She stepped further into the light, and the severity of her condition became horrifyingly apparent. There were dark purple bruises blooming along her collarbone, and her wrist bore the unmistakable raw chafe marks of heavy restraints. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered. Summer, my God, Diane whispered momentarily, tearing her eyes away from Jack. Then Summer's erratic gaze landed on Patty Williams. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Summer let out a shriek so piercing, so filled with absolute unadulterated agony that it seemed to vibrate the very glass of the yacht's portholes. She scrambled backward, hitting the bulkhead, throwing her arms over her head in a defensive, cowering posture. No, 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 no. Keep her away from me, Summer screamed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Don't let her touch me. The cabin descended into stunned paralysis. Patty tilted her head, a grotesque, confused smile playing on her lips. Well, if it isn't the little Newman princess, you shouldn't have run away, sweetheart. We were having such fun. Fun, Kyle echoed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. What is she talking about, Summer? In a state of sheer desperation, broken by the trauma that had fractured her mind, Summer unleashed the horrifying secret she had carried across the Atlantic. It was her, Summer wailed, pointing a shaking, bruised finger at Patty. It was her in Milan. She's the one. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What do you mean she was in Milan? Billy demanded, his eyes darting between Patty and his niece. She was the older woman, Summer sobbed, her words tumbling out in a frantic, hysterical rush. Everyone thought I was just stressed that Marchetti was overwhelming me, but I was taken. I was locked in a basement, a dark, windowless room under the city, and she was there. Summer's breathing hitched as the flashbacks assaulted her. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were burned into her retinas. The sensory details of her torture spilled from her lips in a horrifying cascade. She starved me. She played that awful screeching music day and night so I couldn't sleep. She would come into the room with things, knives, burning metal. She told me I had to pay for the sins of my family. She told me she was going to kill me slowly so that Victor would feel every ounce of my pain. Kyle felt the deck sway beneath his feet, nausea rising in his throat. His ex-wife, the mother of his child, the woman he had loved, had been enduring unimaginable atrocities while they all believed she was simply thriving in the Italian fashion world. She tortured me, Summer wept, collapsing to her knees, clutching her chest as if her heart were physically breaking. She kept me in a cage. She tried to drown me in a bathtub. I only escaped because she left to come here. She left me tied up, and I broke my own thumb to slip the ropes. Summer held up her left hand, swollen, bruised, and grotesquely mangled, a physical testament to her desperate bid for survival. Patty simply giggled, a hollow, soulless sound. You were a very naughty bird, Summer, trying to fly the coop. The sound of heavy rushing footsteps on the dock heralded the arrival of Nick Newman and Phyllis Summers. They had been tracking Summers' passport pings, having realized only hours ago that their daughter had boarded a frantic last-minute flight to Chicago and then vanished. Bursting into the cabin, Phyllis was a hurricane of fiery maternal instinct. Summer, oh my God, Summer. But as Phyllis dropped to the floor to gather her broken, weeping daughter into her arms, Nick froze in the doorway. Nick Newman was a man hanging by a thread. For weeks, the pressure of the Newman empire, the lingering trauma of his past, and a creeping, insidious depression had driven him back into the dark embrace of addiction. He was sweating profusely, his skin pale and clammy, his hands trembling with a desperate need for a pill, a drink, anything to numb the gnawing ache in his soul. He had been fighting a losing battle, hiding his relapses from his family, drowning in his own private hell. But the sight of his daughter bruised, battered, and broken on the floor of a yacht, and the realization of what she was saying acted like a bucket of ice water over his chemical haze. The shock was so profound, so violently jarring, that it shattered the fog of his addiction in an instant, replacing it with a cold, terrifying clarity. What happened to her? Nick choked out, his voice cracking. It was Patty Nick, Billy said, his voice grim, his eyes locked on the deranged woman. Patty Williams. She had Summer in Milan. She tortured her. Phyllis's head snapped up. The fiery, formidable Phyllis Summers, a woman who had fought tooth and nail for everything she had, was suddenly paralyzed. Her beautiful, vibrant daughter had been locked in a cage, abused, and nearly murdered, and she, her mother, had known nothing. The guilt and the horror hit Phyllis with the force of a freight train. She was utterly speechless, her mouth opening and closing as she stared at the bruised face of her child. Then the paralysis broke, replaced by a volcanic, unyielding rage. Phyllis gently laid Summer's head against the bulkhead and rose to her feet, her eyes burning with a murderous fire. "You," Phyllis hissed, advancing on Patty. "You touched my daughter. You put your filthy, psychotic hands on my little girl." "Wait," Phyllis, stop. Nick yelled, his parental instinct overriding his physical withdrawal. He stepped in front of Phyllis, holding her back before she could tear Patty limb from limb. "We need answers. How the hell did Patty Williams get to Milan? She's supposed to be locked up in a high-security psychiatric facility. She doesn't have the resources to cross the street, let alone cross the Atlantic, set up a torture dungeon, and then charter a private yacht back to Genoa City to kidnap Jack." The cabin went dead silent. Only the sound of Jack's labored breathing and Summer's quiet sobbing filled the space. The pieces of the puzzle were suspended in the air, horrifying and jagged. Kyle looked at the yacht's registration documents he had pulled up on his phone earlier. A shell corporation, a dissolved subsidiary. Victor Summer whispered from the floor, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "She told me in the dark when she was hurting me, she said the mustache gave her the keys to my cage." Nick stumbled back as if he had been physically struck. No, my father. He can be ruthless, but he wouldn't do this to his own granddaughter. "He didn't care," Summer cried out, her voice breaking. "He used her. He funded Patty. He got her out of the asylum. He sent her to Milan to keep me out of the way, to punish me for siding with Marchetti for defying him. And he promised Patty that if she did his dirty work in Italy, he would bring her back to Genoa City and deliver Jack Abbott to her on a silver platter." The revelation hit the room like a seismic charge. The dark, twisted connection between Patty Williams and Victor Newman was laid bare. Victor had weaponized a severely mentally ill woman, unleashing her on his own granddaughter in a foreign country, all as a convoluted demonic chess move to ultimately eliminate Jack Abbott and assert total dominance over his enemies. Diane gasped, covering her mouth in horror. Billy looked sick to his stomach. Phyllis let out a guttural scream of pure, unadulterated anguish and fury, a mother realizing the monster was not just the woman standing before her, but the grandfather of her child. Nick sank against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor, his hands gripping his hair. The addiction clawing at his veins was nothing compared to the toxic, lethal poison of his own bloodline. Genoa City would never be the same. The Newman patriarch had crossed a line so despicable, so profoundly evil, that there was no turning back. As police sirens finally began to wail in the distance, piercing the foggy night, the Abbott and Newman families remained trapped in the claustrophobic cabin of the times. Sea siren times forever, scarred by the horrifying truth of Victor. Newman's ultimate betrayal